My own son turned his back on me because his wife didn't want extra responsibilities. So 4 months later, I bought the complex they live in and doubled their rent and made them pay for their betrayal. I, 58M, never thought I'd be writing this, but here I am, 4 months after my world fell apart, finally ready to share what happened and what I did about it. It started when I had my stroke. Not a massive one, thank God, but enough to leave me with some mobility issues and needing help with daily tasks. The doctor said I'd recover most of my function with time and physical therapy, but I'd need assistance for at least 6 months, maybe longer. My son had always been my pride and joy. We'd built our relationship on mutual respect and love, or so I thought. When I called him from the hospital, barely able to speak clearly, I expected him to drop everything and come. Instead, he said he'd visit when he could. The visit came 3 days later. He walked into my hospital room with his wife trailing behind him, her face already set in that expression I'd learned to recognize over the years, the one that meant she'd already made up her mind about something and wasn't going to budge. My son looked uncomfortable as he asked about my condition. I explained what the doctors had told me, how I'd need help getting around, preparing meals, managing medications. Basic stuff that any family would handle together. I wasn't asking for them to move in or sacrifice their lives. I just needed some support while I got back on my feet. That's when his wife stepped forward and laid out their position. She told me they couldn't take on extra responsibilities right now. They had their own lives to think about, their careers, their future plans. She made it sound like helping me would somehow derail their entire existence. I watched my son's face as she spoke. He wouldn't meet my eyes. When I asked him directly what he thought, he mumbled something about it being complicated and how they'd already discussed it. The way he said they'd discussed it told me everything I needed to know about who was really making the decisions in their marriage. I tried reasoning with them. I reminded my son of all the times I'd been there for him. When he was struggling in college, when he needed money for his first apartment, when he was job hunting, and I let him live with me rent-free for 8 months. I wasn't throwing it in his face, just trying to help him remember that families help each other. His wife cut me off mid-sentence. She said they appreciated everything I'd done in the past, but that was different. They were young then, she said, and now they had responsibilities. The irony wasn't lost on me. Apparently, I was no longer one of those responsibilities. My son finally spoke up, but only to agree with her. He said they'd looked into assisted living facilities and found some nice places that could help me. He even had brochures. They'd done their research. All right, research into how to get rid of me as quickly and cleanly as possible. I felt something break inside me that day. Not just my heart, but something deeper. The fundamental trust I'd had in my son. The belief that blood meant something. That the years we'd shared had built something unshakable between us. They left that day promising to help me find a good facility. I never heard from them again about it. Instead, I got a text message a week later saying they'd found a place that had an opening and I should call them. No offer to visit. No offer to help me move. Nothing. I didn't call the facility. Instead, I called my lawyer. See, what my son and his wife didn't know was that I'd been quite successful in my business ventures over the years. I'd always lived modestly, never flashing money around, never making a big deal about my investments. They knew I was comfortable, but they had no idea how comfortable. My lawyer was an old friend who'd handled my affairs for decades. When I told him what had happened, he was as disgusted as I was. He'd known my son since he was a kid and couldn't believe the boy had turned out this way. That's when my lawyer mentioned something interesting. He'd been tracking some real estate investments for me, and one of them was about to come up for sale. It was a small apartment complex in the trendy part of town where young professionals like to live. The current owner was retiring and looking for a quick, cash sale. I asked him to look into it. What I discovered made me smile for the first time since my stroke. My son and his wife lived in that complex. They'd moved there 2 years ago, drawn by the reasonable rent and the hip neighborhood. They'd bragged about finding such a great deal in such a desirable area. They had no idea their landlord was about to retire. The wheels started turning in my head. I had the cash. I had the motivation. And I had absolutely nothing left to lose when it came to my relationship with my son. The purchase went through quickly. Cash talks. And the seller was eager to close and move to Florida. Within 6 weeks of my son's hospital visit, I owned the building where he lived. I spent the next month recovering and planning. My physical therapy was going well, and my mobility was improving daily. Turns out I didn't need as much help as the doctors initially thought. Funny how motivation can speed up recovery. I also spent time learning about property management and tenant rights. I wanted to do this right, legally and thoroughly. My lawyer helped me understand exactly what I could and couldn't do as a landlord. The complex had 12 units, and most of the leases were coming up for renewal around the same time. Perfect timing. I started with the other tenants first. Nice people, all of them. I met with each one personally, explained that I was the new owner, and offered them reasonable rent increases. Nothing dramatic, just enough to bring the rents in line with current market rates. Most were happy to stay. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. I knocked on my son's door on a Tuesday evening. His wife answered, and the look of shock on her face was worth every penny I'd spent on that building. I introduced myself as the new landlord and said I needed to discuss their lease renewal. My son appeared behind her, and I watched the color drain from his face as he realized what was happening. I kept it professional. I told them their current lease was expiring and presented them with their renewal options. The rent was doubling. Not because I was being vindictive, I explained, but because their unit had been significantly under market value for years. I'd had it appraised, and the new rent was actually on the lower end of comparable units in the area. My son started to say something about family, but I cut him off. I reminded him that he'd made it very clear that family obligations were too much responsibility for him to handle. I was simply treating them like any other tenant now. His wife demanded to know if this was legal. I assured her it was completely legal and handed her the documentation my lawyer had prepared. Everything was by the book. They had 30 days to decide whether to accept the new terms or move out. I left them standing in their doorway, mouths open, holding the lease renewal papers. Update 1. The next few days were interesting. My son called me repeatedly, but I didn't answer. He left voicemails that started angry, then became pleading, then angry again. His wife apparently forbade him from agreeing to the new rent, calling it extortion. My lawyer assured me that what I was doing was completely legal. The previous owner had been charging below-market rent for years, and bringing it up to current standards was not only legal, but expected in the current market. 2 weeks into their 30-day notice period, my son showed up at my house. I'd moved back home by then, managing just fine on my own with minimal help from a cleaning service twice a week. He looked terrible. He'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He asked if we could talk, and I let him in. He started by apologizing, saying he understood now that they'd made a mistake at the hospital. He claimed his wife had been stressed about her job and hadn't been thinking clearly. He wanted to know if we could work something out, maybe a payment plan for the rent increase. I listened to everything he had to say. Then I asked him a simple question. If I hadn't bought his building, would he be here apologizing? He couldn't answer that. I told him that his apology might mean something if it had come before he found out I was his landlord. As it stood, it just sounded like someone trying to get out of paying market rate rent. He tried a different approach then, talking about how much he loved me and how family should stick together. I reminded him that he'd had the chance to stick together when I needed him, and he'd chosen his wife's convenience over his father's well-being. He left without getting the answer he wanted. Update 2. They paid the increased rent. I found out later that his wife had to take a second job to cover the difference. My son picked up extra freelance work on weekends. They'd also had to give up their gym memberships, their streaming services, and their weekly date nights. I felt a twinge of something, not quite guilt, but something close to it. Then I remembered lying in that hospital bed, scared and alone, while my own son chose his wife's comfort over his father's need. The twinge passed. 3 months into the new lease, my son's wife came to see me alone. She looked exhausted and defeated. She asked if there was anything she could do to get the rent reduced. She offered to help me with household tasks, grocery shopping, anything I needed. The irony was beautiful. She was offering to provide the exact help they'd refused to give me when I actually needed it. I told her I appreciated the offer, but I was managing fine on my own now. My recovery had gone better than expected, and I'd learned to be quite independent. I didn't need their help anymore. She broke down crying then, saying they couldn't afford to keep living there much longer. The rent was eating up too much of their income, and they were struggling to save money for their future. I handed her some tissues and told her I understood how difficult it must be to have financial responsibilities that felt overwhelming. I suggested they might want to look into more affordable housing options that better suited their budget and lifestyle. She left looking even more defeated than when she'd arrived. Update 3. 6 months after I bought the building, they moved out. I watched from my window as they loaded their belongings into a rented truck. They'd found a smaller apartment in a less desirable part of town, but it was what they could afford. My son came to my door one last time before they left. He looked older somehow, like the experience had aged him beyond his years. He told me he finally understood what I'd been trying to teach him. He said he realized now that family obligations weren't burdens to be avoided, but responsibilities that came with love and commitment. He asked if there was any way we could rebuild our relationship. I thought about it for a long moment. Part of me wanted to forgive him immediately, to welcome him back and pretend none of this had happened. But another part of me, the part that had been hurt so deeply, wasn't ready for that yet. I told him that understanding the lesson was just the first step. Living it was what mattered. I said that maybe someday we could rebuild what we'd lost, but it would take time and consistent actions, not just words. He nodded and said he understood. Then he did something that surprised me. He hugged me. It was the first physical contact we'd had since before my stroke. As I watched their truck disappear down the street, I felt something I hadn't expected: sadness. Not regret, exactly, but sadness that it had come to this. Sadness that my son had needed such a harsh lesson to understand what should have been natural. But I also felt something else: peace. For the first time in months, I felt like justice had been served. Not cruel revenge, but appropriate consequences for choices made. I still own the building. I've been a fair landlord to my other tenants, and the property has been a good investment. Sometimes I wonder if my son and his wife learned anything lasting from the experience, or if they just see me as the vindictive father who made their lives difficult. I suppose time will tell. What I do know is that I learned something too. I learned that I'm stronger than I thought, more independent than I believed, and that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who'll abandon you the fastest when it becomes inconvenient. I also learned that there's a difference between forgiveness and enabling. I may forgive my son someday, but I'll never again assume that family loyalty is automatic or unconditional. The building is doing well, my health has improved dramatically, and I've built a good life for myself. I have friends who check on me regularly, neighbors who've become like family, and a sense of self-reliance I never had before. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting better. And that's exactly what I did.